Hi, I'm Chamomile Jones, and today I'm going to be showing you how I use Bruscho watercolor pigments. I'm going to demonstrate a whole piece just using one color. That's going to be the olive green. And you'll be surprised when I open it up. It's not going to look green, but it will be orange. There's some blue in there, and when those two um, crystals meet and get wet, they will turn into a green. So I'm going to pour a little bit of this powder, pigment powder, into, I have an aluminum baking dish here that I always use. There's a little bit in here from the other day, and you'll notice, if you look at my channel, you can see some shorts of paintings I did the last few days. I've done in this pigment. So now I'm going to show you my brushes that I'm going to use. I have a variety of squirrel hair brushes and synthetic brushes, different sizes, and I have a Hake brush. And I'm using Arches watercolor paper. This particular piece has a little bit of a stain on it, but it'll be fine. So we're going to get our Hake brush nice and wet, and we're going to put a nice coating of water on the paper. It's not going to make it too like soaked, but we need it wet enough that it looks shiny, and go about 2/3 of the way down the paper. I like to divide my paper into thirds and think of 2/3 as the horizon line and up through the sky. And then I'm going to take my number 12 brush and get it nice and wet in the water and dribble some of that water into my pigment. And notice I'll just do one side of the pigment because I want to leave some of it as a powder. And I got quite a bit on there, and I'm just kind of dropping it, holding my brush really loosely and for pretty far back. And so when you're making clouds, I generally, if I'm just using one color like this, I will leave areas that are just white, but since they are saturated with water, the color will bleed into them and make a nice soft edge. So you don't want any harsh lines on your clouds. And the other general rule I like to follow when I'm doing a landscape like this is to have the sky darkest at the top. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, this is what I kind of rule I follow for myself. And I get light as I go towards the horizon. And so it's super easy to do that. You just have less color on your brush, so you can water down your brush a little more. And then I try to make it a fairly smooth transition between the darkest color and the lightest color. And honestly, this guy wasn't my best, but it'll do. So don't be too hard on yourself. Watercolor kind of tends to fix itself as it goes. You'll notice that as I am painting other parts of the painting, this sky will kind of morph on its own a little bit. And the coolest thing about working with these pigments instead of a normal watercolor paint is that you will have the pigments separate a little bit. And so you'll see an orange glow starting to bleed out of these clouds. And that is from the orange crystals in the pigment separating out. And sometimes you might even see some blue coming out all on its own. And so wherever you have a lot of water on the page and the pigment is allowed to bleed on it on its own without you brushing it there, that will separate it on its own just kind of randomly. So I do it on purpose, but the only way I'm in control of that is by the amount of water I have on the page. Okay, so now we're going to work on our kind of mid-ground. And I'm going to get a lot of pigment, and that paper is still pretty wet. And so the pigment is going to move towards the water. It's not going to move downwards where it's all dry. So this makes it super easy for me to create a tree line. All I have to do is just kind of dab at the paper with the very tip of my brush and let the pigment kind of just fall onto the paper all by itself. Not putting much pressure. I'm just doing little tiny dabs onto the paper. And notice that I get narrower and narrower as I go towards the center. And then I have a taller and taller section on either edge of the paper. It's just a general composition trick that I use. Now I have to decide, what do I want in the foreground? A lake, a field, some snow, trees, what are we going to do? And at first I was thinking snow, but then I changed my mind and said, let's do a pond. And so I'm going to pull down some of that pigment just using water at first. And this is a super easy way to make a reflection. I have some extra water, and then here I want to kind of lengthen that reflection, so I got a little bit of pigment on. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, just pulling some of that pigment downwards with some extra water and adding more pigment where I think I need it. And it will now naturally flow downwards, where remember before it only flowed up, and that was because it was only wet towards the top. Now we've added water underneath, and so the pigment's going to flow down. So we'll just fill in a little bit of pigment for the pond, and notice my brush has hardly any color on it at all. And now I'm just going to let you watch while I fill in a base for the foreground. And now I'm going to dry this with the blow dryer before I do some final touches. Okay, now we're going to grab a smaller brush. This is an 8, and get it saturated in the water, and then grab quite a bit of pigment so that we're getting really dark color, almost black. And you're going to hold your brush close to the tip, so not as loose like we did before, and try to control the brush and do a pretty straight line. Mine's kind of wobbly, but don't stress out about it. And I'm going to bring that line all the way up into the white of the cloud so that we can have some nice contrast for the top of the tree. We're going to be doing some pine trees, which are the easiest trees, in my opinion, to do. And all you need to do is do tiny little dabs on the paper to look like branches. And oftentimes I will switch back and forth between using the very tip and then holding my brush kind of flat and using the shape of the brush to my advantage. So if you notice um, these watercolor brushes will often have a taper, so like one side will have the hair cut shorter than the other side. So it will kind of come to a point, and one side will be fatter than the other. And so I'll use that side that's been cut and have that be what's touching the surface of the paper. So look at your brushes so you can see what I mean by that. And not all brushes are that way, so I have different types of brushes. This particular one is. And so when I want a flatter, a more elongated shape, I use that. And when I want to do very precise little marks, I'll use the tip. And notice how sometimes I'm pulling the brush out to the sides, and other times I'm doing some little blobs right in the center of the trunk. And the ones that are just kind of in the center, those are supposed to represent branches that are coming straight towards you. And then you'll have branches on the sides, and you can angle some off as if they're going towards the back. And don't be afraid to leave a decent amount of space in between them. So then you can kind of get a nice contrast between the light color in the background and your branches in the foreground. Just work your way all the way down the trunk. One thing I wanted to mention before I forget again is that these pigments, these Bruscho pigments, are different from regular watercolors in that they are completely staining. What I mean by that is you cannot erase. So with most regular watercolor, if you make a mistake or you want to lighten an area, it's super easy. All you have to do is add extra water on your brush and kind of scrub at the color and then dab at it with some paper toweling, and you'll be able to lift the color off. Well, with these Bruscho pigments, that is not the case. So you basically are stuck with whatever you've put on the page that's going to be there. You can't scrub it off. The one advantage though that you have with these Bruscho is that it really does soak into this paper very deeply. And with watercolor, you often have to do several washes or several times over the color if you want a dark, deep, rich color, and one that you can paint over the top of. It's almost like if you do enough with regular watercolor, if you do enough passes over an area, it's almost like it seals the paper, more similar to, say, acrylic, and then you can then go over a dark color with a light color and it will still show up. And so with these Bruscho pigments, I can do that just after this one time painting through. I could go in with, say, a white or a yellow or an orange, some sort of brighter color than what I have on the page, and it will show up right away just after one layer down of this darker color. And so sometimes I use these Bruscho pigments in all the background, and then I can go in with my regular watercolors and add some highlights of, like, for flowers or blades of grass with a brighter color. So it kind of speeds up the process. But the downfall is that, you can't erase, you can't lift off. So just keep that in mind if you're going to use these as regular watercolors. I'm just going to add in a few little details, some grasses. And you can spend hours doing this kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into it too much because it's just a demonstration. Another thing I'm going to show you in a second here is how to put in a few highlights using a scratching off technique. So oftentimes along the shoreline, I like to delineate between the reflection and the trees. I'm using a pen that actually has a blade as a tip, and I'm going to just very gently scratch away at that line that I kind of marked in, so I can get a distinction between the shoreline and the water. And then I can do some highlights in the water by just scratching that away. And this is the only way that you can kind of erase when you're using Bruscho, because that blade will kind of dig down into the paper and reveal the white paper that's deeper in the layers of the paper. I'm going to come in with some Daniel Smith watercolors and just do a few highlights on these blades of grass so you can see how that works on top of this Bruscho. So this is, I'm using like a beige or taupe kind of color. And it's just going to add a little bit of depth into those grasses. And the nice thing is if you don't like what you did, you can just dab at it with your finger and kind of mute it or erase it that way with the watercolor. There you have it. Let's peel off the tape and see how it looks. So thanks for watching, and I hope you'll subscribe and come back for more videos. And happy painting!